Okay, this is entitled Finding God Among the Chaos, Insights into Tisha B'av. And believe it or not, it comes from Midrash, Rabbah, Parshat, Lecha. Of course, we know that Tisha B'av is about not only the destruction of the first and second temple, but of many, many tragedies that happened. And I'm trying to connect that back with something that happened to Avram. In fact, I have to apologize. I could be ruining a famous story that you have been told as a kid about Avram. And that story goes as follows. There was a great castle that was lit up at night. It was huge and intricate, and Avram was looking at it, and he realized that there must be only one power behind all this, somebody who commissioned it, someone who was built for, and someone who's running the whole place. And therefore he extrapolated that there's only one God in our big immense world that we live in. It's got to be only also one power running it, one prime mover, and that is a story we all grew up on. So the funny thing about the story is that it appears in, as I said, Midrash Rabbah and Lecha, but some people don't read it that way. It really all revolves around the word, Lech, which can either mean to light up, or it could mean on fire, to burn, and also whether it's read as a statement or a question. So let me give you another way of reading the same exact story, and that is that Avram Avinu was looking at this great immense palace that it was on fire at night. It was being engulfed by flames, and Avram thought to himself, surely there's no person who cares about this. There's nobody in charge of this palace who would let it burn down like that. So just like in the first story, God introduced himself to Avraham after he used his intuition to figure out that there is a God. So in this version, God introduced himself to Avram to tell him, yes, there is someone. I do own this palace. There is someone running the world. And even though it looks chaotic, you have to understand it's all purposeful. It's all for a reason. Now, what was throwing Avram off? Of course, the state of the world was in havoc. As you know, there was the Tower of Babel, where they actually thought they wanted to prevent another episode of the flood. So they thought maybe this is just a big plumbing problem. So they built this big tower, and they went up there to fix the problem. And while they're up there, they thought they would fight with God and prevent another flood. And of course, the consequence for this was that they no longer all spoke one language. They were all unified under one language, and God split that language into 70 languages. This is my brother's life work, by the way, because that original language he calls Edenics, what was spoken in the Garden of Eden. It was Hebrew, and he proves that all languages start with Hebrew in any case. So once they split up into different languages, people started to fight with each other. They couldn't understand each other. They wanted to live among those who spoke the same language. They were all moving in the Dor HaFlaga. They were all moving to different parts of the world to take up residency with those who spoke the same language. So it's that kind of chaos that Avram was trying to make sense of. And you have to understand, chaos is something that's hard to find God in that state. I mean, think of a Jew in 1943. Not only was it disheartening and that the whole world was at war with each other, but imagine, what was going on with Jews who's, were being slaughtered with impunity. So how, among that chaos, how do you see God's role? And now if you have a religious perspective and you read the Torah, especially the Tochacha, which is, these dire warnings of consequences that would happen to us, so you might say, wow, that sounds just like what appears twice in the Torah. But if you didn't have that religious perspective, very difficult. And it's very reminiscent of, when they went to the great writer of Holocaust books, Elie Wiesel, and they said, where was God in the Holocaust? And he said, where was man? So getting back to our main issue, we have two different readings of this same parable. One connotes that Avram was discovering God, and God introduced himself. The other one was that Avram did not know how to make sense of it. It seemed like God was absent, and then God had to introduce himself. So how do you make sense of this? In Midrash, unlike other parts of the Torah, let's say in the Talmud, if there's a contradiction, so there's two opinions, that's just the way it is. But in Midrash, we often find that two opinions means they are both true, and you have to reconcile them. So along comes a brilliant commentator, Isha Nechalim, and he weaves them together, and it really makes sense and teaches us very important lessons. So he says, of course, Avram discovered God through his own intuition long before this, but when he encountered this havoc of the time that he was living in, so his intuition sort of didn't work anymore. He figured, okay, perhaps God doesn't always rule. Perhaps God sometimes lets things go by chance, lets natural forces of man go at each other's throats and steps back. So that's why God had to introduce himself, and he said, no, this is all purposeful. This is all for a reason. What looks like chaos is really order and purposeful, because there are consequences here, and justice has to be served, and that's what the process you're looking at, that justice is going to prevail over the way people acted toward one another. Now, of course, we can take that same idea, and I think that's what Tisha B'av teaches us, and that's the relationship I'd like to make between this story and Tisha B'av, because in Tisha B'av also we're trying to grapple with huge calamities in Jewish history, and how do you make sense of it? And I think the answer is the same. You have to step back and say, it looks chaotic, but God is in control, and it's all for a reason. In fact, we even use the term Hester Panim, that God almost hides his face at this time, but it doesn't mean that God is letting go of control of the world. There are terrible consequences for what we did, and we have to live through these consequences in order to serve a just world, in order to repair the relationship with God, in order to bring our final redemption. It's hard to understand, and it's hard to process. But even when you see these calamities, it is taking us towards something better, because the consequences are playing out and the relationship is being repaired. So that's how I believe that the story of Avraham helps us understand the role of Tisha B'av. Have a great Shabbat.